Well, I'll start. Thanks for the introduction, Edwidge. I'm Karen, and we're in Washington, D.C., as Maris is as well. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I see 43 participants. That's amazing. I want to thank Edwidge also for running these book clubs. It's something that we had never done before, and it seems to be growing and growing in popularity. So today, you're all here for a Q&A to talk about the book, Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Goes to the Classroom. And the co-authors are Florencia and Maris. I'll give you a little bit of background about them. Quite impressive, both of them. Florencia has a PhD in Second Languages Acquisition and Teacher Education from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And she is now the director of advanced Spanish there, right, Florencia?
Yes.
She's an award-winning educator who has published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration and research-based pedagogical practices. She's also the host, I have to listen to this podcast, by the way, I didn't know about it, Unpacking Language Pedagogy, and it's on YouTube as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, it's more on YouTube than the podcast, but I'll catch up at some point when I find some time. Yes.
Okay, we'll look for that on YouTube. And in this on YouTube in this podcast, she summarizes and discusses research articles, activities, terms, and all kinds of topics related to language pedagogy. So that's super for our teachers. We're going to let everybody know about that as well.
I'm putting the link in the chat too.
Okay, great. Dr. Henshaw is a certified ACTFL oral proficiency interview tester, and she's also a member of the board of directors of the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese. So you speak both languages then?
No, just Spanish.
Just Spanish, okay.
Yes.
All right, so Maris is a lower and middle school Spanish teacher at the Capitol Hill Day School in Washington, D.C., and she has a master's in teaching teaching foreign languages from the University of Virginia. That's impressive as well, especially for UVA.
Thank you.
She's taught Spanish at all levels from elementary school through high school. And she's presented at the VIS. What is the VIS Technology Conference? Virginia Association of
Independent Schools.
Independent Schools. Okay, interesting. I had never heard of that association. And has talked about arts integration in the classroom through the Kennedy Center's VSA program. In addition, she has presented on technology tools to use in a proficiency-based language classroom at NECTFL. Tell me what that is. And I know what GWAFL is, Greater Washington Association of Teachers of Foreign Languages. What is NECTFL, N-E-C-T-F-L?
The Northeast Council,
okay.
I think.
Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages.
Yes.
Okay, cool, wow. All right, so welcome and thank you so much for giving us your time for this Q&A. And again, welcome to the rest of you for participating. So here we go. Edwidge, you're the leader on this one.
Yes, thank you. All right, so we have about 14 questions and I'll try to move us along. I don't know that we'll cover them all. Everybody's here. I just want to say again that the book club members very much enjoyed the book club. Those who can't be here today look forward to the recording. There was a general sense that we needed something practical, and the section on what does this look like in the classroom has been perceived as really useful by the book club readers. So thank you for putting out this really useful book. I tried to organize the questions by themes the best I could, and I tried to combine some of the questions because we got a lot of them. So the first two questions are about the role of the textbook versus, using a textbook versus designing your own curriculum. And the question is, what tips might you have for supervising language educators who are attached to the textbook and are hesitant to design their own materials, even when collaboration and materials sharing is encouraged across teams? And you guys can decide, or both take a stab at the question.
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for organizing the book club. I know how much work it was, so we really appreciate it, and we also appreciate this chance to answer questions. So the the first question about, how can you get them, I guess, more motivated to design their own materials could be to help them see how the students could be more engaged, more motivated. It could have more relevance to the students. Sometimes students lose interest if the textbook is perhaps too generic. The students just don't find it personally relevant. So what I would say is, don't just say, create your own curriculum, good luck, read Common Ground and figure it out. Like, not that, because that is daunting, even for me. I don't know for you, Maris, but I would be like, I don't know where to start. But just start with one thing. Maybe the text, the reading in the textbook is a little bit dry. The students are not going to be into it. How about you change that? What is the topic that your students really like to talk about? And create a little something. What about if you ask a friend who speaks the target language and has a funny story to tell? Hey, can you record a 1-minute video on Flipgrid and then I can use it in my class? Even just starting with small things that you can add, and not necessarily that daunting thing of create your own curriculum. Just little by little, start changing things. And I think that when you start personalizing it, you start to see how much more the learners react to the material and engage with the material. I'll give you a quick example. I love creating my own thing, so I'm the exception, right? I'm the kind of person that is like, let's create everything. But one thing I did was the reading for a course. And this is a course that's called Spanish in the Professions. The students are novice high, so we're not being interpreters, right? This is more in terms of understanding how Spanish can help us in the professional world. Instead of using the texts that come with most textbooks that are about like international business, that's not what my students are into. So I just took let's find out about a local Latino entrepreneur. And let me find out, somebody that opened an ice cream store here in Urbana where I live, but he has kind of an interesting life story. And I just created simple sentences that my students would understand. And then we're learning about somebody in our community. It is simplified language, yes. I don't have a problem with that because I want the students to feel good about understanding. But you see how they were like, whoa, one student even told me, oh my God, I know him. And it's just immediately, you know what I mean? They want to share, they want to understand and engage with it. So even if you start there, I do think you're going to get that bug of, ooh, let me create a little bit more. But you got to start with something just concrete, one thing, and something that you think the students would really like. Start there. And little by little, see what else can be tweaked. Not everything, not all at once. And we're not about just ditching the textbook, which is something that we address in the epilogue, right? It's not that ditching the textbook automatically makes you a good language teacher, right? It's not about that. So just start with what can you get your learners really into, one thing. And then from there, what else? And then from there, what else? Little by little, you start creating more and more. But you can also recycle and reuse things that other teachers are using. That's okay too.
And what I would also add is, Florencia touched on this a little bit, but there's always a unit that you think, I don't know why I'm teaching this, and I don't know what my students are getting out of it. For me, it was the camping unit. And I mean, for my students, it took me forever to go from starting to make these changes to actually creating my own curriculum where I am, but it took years and years. So, my first step was ditching that camping curriculum. It was a Spanish 1 class and I didn't know some of the words myself. I was like, why am I teaching them sleeping bag? And so I think there are definitely entry points that you can find. And, maybe after you've done some activities, creating a unit is not as daunting. And then after you've done that a couple of times and you've reused some of it, then that's when you can, think of another one that maybe isn't as useful. So I definitely encourage, just like Florencia said, those baby steps. And you can do a lot of these ideas that we gave within a traditional textbook. It doesn't have to be something that is done completely separate of a textbook.
And recycling, right? So maybe Maris has a little, I don't know, Pear Deck activity that she shared, and well, the topic doesn't quite work, but at least it gets, you know, your creative juices flowing and saying, oh, what if I just change this sentence? What if I just, that is creating your own materials too, right? You get inspiration from somebody, you go from there. So if you have somebody that is just the daunting thing of creating the whole curriculum, the daunting thing of creating activity from scratch, start with something that is almost there, you know, in baby steps. Yeah.
So a quick follow-up question, and that question came from a couple people who write textbooks, and they were asking, summarizing, how could textbooks be made more useful and appropriate for the way we want to teach languages?
Yeah, so one thing, if I can do a quick pitch. So I'm giving a session at ACTFL. If anybody's going to ACTFL in November, I'm giving a session with Dr. Claudia Fernandez from University of Illinois, Chicago, on how you can keep the textbook and yet still be proficiency or communicative. We're also doing it at ICTFL. If you're going to ICTFL in October, we'll be there as well. Anyway, I have written textbooks. I have worked with textbook publishers, right? So it's not about being anti-textbook. The one thing that I'm like, a deal breaker for me that I think textbooks need to change is to provide better input-based activities, better comprehension-based activities. These are the hardest for teachers to create. They're hard for me to create, and I have written textbooks. They're hard. They take time. It takes time to find text. It takes time to create the pre-reading. It takes time to do the, what am I going to ask them? Those take time. It's a lot easier for me to create a presentational. Hey, start here, do this, do that. Here's a product, beautiful. The comprehension is the interpretive ones are the ones that take time. So we know how important interpretive proficiency is. We know how important input is for acquisition and for language development. So please, textbook publishers, start there, right? Emphasize the input part a lot more. Help us with good text, oral text, written text. Help us with that. Help us with those activities. So I would prefer to see so many of those vocab lists and so many of those grammar sections be replaced by good comprehensible input, some authentic, some revised. Okay, let's start there. To me, that is the first big step that needs to happen. I think some textbooks are getting a little bit better in terms of being proficiency informed. So they understand, well, if this is a textbook for novice learners, we're not going to ask them to write, you know, a letter to the editor. Okay. Some textbooks at least are getting a little bit better at matching proficiency levels. I still think we need to do a little better. Some of them move too fast. So they need to really understand what a novice learner can do in the different modes and how we can help them to develop their language at a rate that is reasonable and realistic for education in an institution, right? Not for the ideal learner that is going to spend hours at home studying, but for the learner who only comes to class 3 times a week, in our case, in higher ed, right? So those will be probably the 2 things that I think textbooks need to start doing so that they're more useful for language teachers who want to emphasize acquisition and communication.
I think also getting away from some of the minute grammar points that textbooks have focused on, and, you know, doing when you're thinking about things like really emphasizing indirect object pronouns and then direct object pronouns and then using both together. But like really step back and think from a proficiency-based perspective, what do the students need to know in order to do this? And in a novice textbook, it doesn't need to be all of the grammar that was previously taught in that Spanish 1 textbook. Same thing with 2 and 3, like especially in Spanish 2, if we could move away from the idea that by the end of Spanish 2, other languages too, French, things like Romance languages, that students will master the past tense. Like if we could move away from that, would be extremely helpful, I think, for both teachers and students, because it's way too much of a daunting task, and we put it in Spanish too. And a lot of teachers think that the expectation is that they'll master that. So even just like moving away from grammar as the guiding force, I think would be really helpful.
So I have a follow-up question. Actually, there were a few questions about assessment and feedback. We had a very engaged conversation about this chapter. The question is, grammar, culture, vocabulary are often assessed separately in textbooks, or just in general. You know, there'll be a vocab test, and then there'll be a grammar fill in the blank, and then we'll talk about culture. How can we encourage educators to move away from this siloed approach to assessment and embrace a more holistic approach to assessment?
What I would say probably, so the first shift that needs to happen is related to what Maris just said, right? This idea of what are we prioritizing, communicating or covering? And then when we make that shift, we also make the shift of what do we value, right? What are we trying to get to? And instead of being the correct use of target language, the structures, or the correct use of certain words, right? The memorization. When we switch from that to successful communication, I gave you the tools, but if you don't remember exactly how to conjugate this verb, if you don't remember exactly the word, but you are able to express it in a different way, that's still communication, that's still language. Language is, you know, flexible and fluid, and we should embrace that a little bit more. Yes, we want to give them the support, the language, the tools that they need, but if they find a different way and it's still successful, then we should still, you know, reward it and embrace it. And I think that at least when you think of communication, when you think of communicative competence, I know we don't talk about it in the book, but I have a little video talking about it that if you can watch it, I recommend it. You know, the idea of communicative competence is not just knowing words, knowing the grammar, and then you put it together, right? It's much more than that. And I think when you're focusing on successful communication, inevitably you're intertwining all of these things rather than separating them, right? You start looking at language more holistically as opposed to compartmentalize, which is what happens in textbooks a lot, right? They divide language into these little boxes or little pieces. As far as culture goes, I think that there are ways of incorporating it, such as, you know, authentic resources, discussions surrounding, meaning if you're going to do like an interpretive activity that is not just here's language, right, but that they're learning content, right, that they're gaining cultural information. Of course, that's one way of incorporating it. I do think we need to be realistic. I think there was maybe a question later on, right, but when it comes to like intercultural competence, this is something that develops over a long period of time, over many different experiences, and it has many different layers, right? So the cultural knowledge and cultural information might be one component of it, but there's much more that goes with it. So if we're talking about novice level, I think it's okay if a lot of what we get in the target language is cultural knowledge, but then maybe we need to switch to the shared language to discuss some of the other layers of culture, right? So that we're not just saying at the surface level. I understand, I mean, obviously every district is going to have their policies, and I don't want to get anybody fired, but I do think that if we can make room to have some important conversations, to challenge some views, to reflect on perspectives, right? By using the shared language, to me, that there's a lot of learning that is happening there, right? And it's okay if you're not assessing their language skills as they're reflecting on cultural perspectives, right? To me, it's okay if for novice learners, we're sort of separating those two things, because sometimes they're not going to have the language to express a lot of this. And so if we want to do it all in one, for novice learners, it's going to be very challenging. You're going to stay very much at the generalization of the cultural perspective. And I don't think that's very helpful. I think we're sacrificing something that shouldn't be sacrificed. That's just my take on it.
And I think some of the questions around assessment, there was one about a department and switching with assessments. I can speak from experience. My former department, when I was teaching in high school and upper school, we made a switch to using IPAs for the end of the year assessment for like our final exam. And that was the first switch that we did. And as we did that, I think just having that one gave us an idea of what we were looking for, an idea of what our students could and could not do. And we just started that in one level as well. And then after that, that was really when we all started making the switch to using more of these more IPA assessments instead of just doing the grammar and vocabulary, and some writing and things like that we had been doing in the past. So for people who are working in a department looking to make the switch, that was very successful for my department. And we ended up moving a little faster after that first year. But that was how we as a whole department switched our assessment style.
And if I can add one more thing, the other layer of assessment that we need to consider, at least in most schools, is grading, right? How the grades are being assigned, right? The rubric part of it, because many times we think of the assessment as just like the task itself. What are the students doing? But if the rubric still says, grammatical accuracy and vocabulary in separate categories, I'm sorry, but you're still assessing them separately, right? So and that's something that I had to go back and look at my rubrics and going, wow, I'm doing this even when I'm not noticing that I'm doing this. So that's the other thing. And at least my students are very grade focused, grade motivated, right? Like they want to know how they're going to be graded, and then they kind of go from there. So if the message we're conveying in the rubric is you need to know your vocab and you need to know your grammar as two separate things, then we are in a way reinforcing this idea of compartmentalizing language.
So there is a question in the chat. It's not really a question, but a request about learning more about rubrics. Do you have a video where you talk about creating those holistic rubrics? Can we order one?
Not yet, but I have come up with a title. I just want, at some conference sometime, I will do one that is, do your rubrics meet or exceed expectations? I just came up with the title, but now I have to come up with the whole presentation. Someday. We wrote a lot about rubrics in the book, just because I think there were some important points of things to reflect on. But everybody's going to have different priorities in different ways, and you have to consider your learners too. There was a discussion on Twitter recently about this, right? For some students, and perhaps it depends very much on the school and the context, seeing that exceeds expectations gets the highest grade, yes, may be demotivating. That's what was happening with our students. They felt like they were trying their best and they were actually at level, but somehow they were getting points off. For them, the points, right? And I had to agree with them, right? That I would find it also a little bit frustrating that I'm performing at the level that you're trying to get me to, and yet I have to keep going, always more. But somebody shared that for their learners, it is motivating to always push for more and push for more. So you have to know your students, you have to go with whatever you think is going to be the best for your students. But yeah, rubrics we can probably talk a lot about.
And then also, I think the other thing with exceeding expectations is it's vague. Like when you say, and then does all this, but exceeds expectations. Like, what does that even look like? And if we're asking for a certain level, why are we asking students to exceed that level that you're on? So I think that's kind of the interesting sticking point as well. If your students do find it motivating, I think the key is to make sure you're being clear about what that exceeding expectations looks like, other than just like some like amorphous thing that they should do in addition to what you're asking for.
Yeah, Christopher made that comment. Oh, I have a lot of trouble with that. A lot of trouble, capital T trouble. Yeah, I mean, as a student, I would feel defeated, right? Like never good enough kind of thing. Yeah, But again, I think sometimes we project how we feel, but we should also listen to our learners and see how they are reacting to. Andy is asking some philosophical questions. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a movement, right? That I think exceeds expectations is going away. Not everywhere, but I think it's getting there. But just, you know, it is not that we're not just hating on exceeds expectations. I think all the wording that we use in our rubrics, we need to reflect on it, right? Even things like exemplary. Wow, I mean, that to me sounds like almost intimidating, right? So let's just think about how we're wording our rubrics and whether the students are feeling supported and capable of reaching that target.
Yeah. So I have one last question on the assessment and feedback, and it's, you know, the other questions were big picture. This is really cutting to the chase. One of our teachers asked, can you give examples of adequate, useful feedback that we can give to students in presentational writing or speaking? I mean, there was a lot of discussion in the book club, what feedback is useful, what feedback is not useful. Teachers couldn't stop talking about it. So what is useful?
I love the topic of feedback. So I think for the sake of being careful with time, is I'm going to put the link to the NFLC talk that I gave recently, where it was, you know, 25 minutes of unpacking feedback. And I just addressed like the main things we tend to do, particularly with presentational writing, but I've also seen it in speaking, things like just the focusing on form, just commenting on performance, right? And some things to keep in mind. To me, the feedback you give, and I also have an article for the language educator coming out, and I talk a little bit about feedback too, feedback on assessments. To me, the way you assess, but then the how you assess, the how you grade, and the kind of feedback that you give, it all needs to be in harmony with your pedagogical priorities, right? On what your goals are, your purpose. And so, you know, if you're claiming to be, you know, proficiency based, and you keep telling the learners that you're not expecting perfection, and then the feedback they get is almost like fix every error, to me it's like there's a dissonance there, like something just doesn't quite match, right? So then we have to keep it. And this is a mental shift that I had to do myself, right? I realized that I was doing that, and I was like, okay, wait a minute, I can't be sending these mixed messages. And so I was like, okay, if I'm valuing successful communication, and I tell them I value successful communication, then my feedback is also going to be communicative. When I don't understand something, I'm going to ask you. When I want to know more about something, I'm going to ask you. The way that I describe it, and I'm going to put the link in a minute, I promise. The way that I described it is feedback and forth. This back and forth idea, the idea of interpersonal communication, I try to remember that when giving feedback, right? That it's not unidirectional. It's not just fix this laundry list of errors, please. That it should be more about, if this person were telling me this, we're having a conversation, you're telling me about what you do on a typical day, how would I respond? Maybe I didn't understand this and I'm going to ask you, or maybe I want to know more about it and I'm going to ask you, right? I think that it helps to think of it that way, also because one of the polio article that we cite, and I can also link to the video where I summarized it, which is a great article. One of the conditions for feedback to be effective is that it has to be purposeful. Students have to do something with it, not just look at it, not just say thank you very much, right? Like, why are we giving them this feedback? What are we expecting feedback to do? And so the idea of having a conversation, if I ask you for clarification, I'm expecting a response, right? So the students need to do something with that feedback I'm giving them. I think that helps. Okay, Maris, go for it while I search for links.
No, I was gonna say, the only thing that I will add that I haven't used myself, but I'm curious to do is I've seen some teachers asking students if they want feedback on a piece, and I have not done this yet. I'm pretty fortunate to have smaller classes. But I think it's a really interesting idea. And I think it goes back to what Florencia was mentioning about like, what are they going to do with it? And then, so if they want it, then that makes more sense. And that also frees you up and gives you more time to focus on the students who are really, and prioritizing the students who really might do more with it.
So Maris, you said you have small classes. I realize we skipped over a question that I think is on a lot of teachers' minds. When you assess interpersonal communication by meeting with 2 students at a time, how do you do this when you have 30 to 32 students in a class? Like,
so I have done, my larger classes were a little smaller, so closer to 18. Typically I would give students an ed puzzle a lot of times to work on. And so they would be listening to something. I think anytime that you can have other students listening to something while you have the conversation going on, I find that effective. And then we talked in the book about some examples with 2 people. I've also done small groups as students get a little higher up in proficiency, and my students like that because I think, I mean, and when we're talking to people, it does require the teacher when we're talking about novice level, because they cannot sustain a conversation in the novice level on their own. But I mean, I've done it before trying to get novice, high, intermediate, low to have a conversation and with 2 people, and it's rough. And there's always a chance that one student is paired up with someone else who is not at their level. And so they're sitting there trying to have this, like, they're trying to talk to this person who's barely responding back. So that's my other suggestion, is do small groups. And my students gave me feedback as well. I'm in their group as well, but they gave me feedback that that's more effective.
Mhm.
So I teach college, and for us, we do a lot of the small group interview, like 2 students at a time with the instructor. And I just redistribute class time instead of everybody having class, synchronous class, come to class twice or 3 times a week. There's no class that week. Instead, they make appointments with the instructor, and maybe everybody else is working on another project, right? So there's a way of just being creative with the time. If you teach higher ed, that's definitely doable. I know that it may seem like you're having less time with the students, but it's almost like it's concentrated, right? Instead of interacting with 20 or 32 students at a time, and I have 32 students over the winter, and I did these, so I understand what it's like when you have 32 students. With 32 students, you hear each one very little, right? It's so hard to keep track of their level and who's struggling with what. It's just, there's a lot. When you have that time to sit down and actually have a conversation with them, you can really get a sense of their skills. And it can be so much more like you establish more of a connection with them. I mean, my students, I ask them, they can ask me any questions. We have fun. We actually have fun. One student in the end of semester course, her favorite part of the course was the oral exam, as she called it, which was the interview. We sat down to have a little chat, So I think that there are ways. There are also constraints. We're not saying that should be applicable to everybody everywhere. We understand in some cases it's just not going to work. I think that if you're going to do novice level interpersonal communication in pairs, and not, you're not intervening, right? Maybe something like recorded or something like that. What I recommend is to do a structured task that is very similar to what they have been doing in class, as opposed to, okay, this is the oral exam, talk about this topic, go. And you get a lot of these students that are not saying much. The other poor student is trying to say as much as they can, right? It doesn't even feel like a conversation anymore. It is difficult. Just have them do something like a student A, student B, and it's structured, and they have the little support to keep it going. they're novice. It's novice learning. It's okay, you know, to not expect almost like intermediate level skills for novice learners, especially for interpersonal is tough. If you have the chance of having a conversation in a language where you are a novice level learner, you will remember how tough interpersonal communication is.
Thank you. So the next set of questions are about direct or explicit grammar instruction. This is also something that everybody discussed at length. I felt like the consensus was, we get it, but it's not necessarily easy to implement. We don't always have the support of the textbook that we would need. We also don't always have the support of the department in which we teach. I mean, there are so many hurdles to moving to a more communicative curriculum. So, you know, one of the question was, came from this teacher who was for years inspired by skill acquisition theory, Kaiser, and designing activities to help students practice using certain forms. And he's reconsidering this model. But he says teaching rules does not mean they will be remembered, but isn't it useful to know, for example, how to write the passive voice if you want to be a scientist, for example, or can you teach this, you know, communicatively?
Right. So what I would probably start, I feel like we need to have a full conversation. Sorry, I'm going to answer with some questions, but I think the level matters, right? So SLA people are not saying grammar rules are evil, and okay, maybe some SLA people might be saying that, but we're not saying that. So focus okay, I don't know if consensus includes everybody or not, but okay, the common ground among many different perspectives is that it's not a matter of whether we should focus on form, but the how and when we should focus on form, right? Are we leading with this? Are we expecting that learning these rules, for me, you know, teaching you the rules of passive voice in English, that now you got it, now you can use it. And I think everybody in SLA agrees that no, it doesn't quite work that way. Now, in the book, we say very briefly, because our main focus is novice and intermediate learners, which is what most of us teach. But there is no verdict yet on what happens with advanced speakers. So somebody who is going to be a scientist or pursuing graduate studies in the language, okay, but we're assuming you already have a certain level of proficiency in the language in terms of communicative abilities, and perhaps you need to tweak, polish, you know, sort of like pay a little closer attention to form, then yes, sure, somebody telling you, hey, this is when you use it, this is when you not use it, you can be more aware of that as you write scientific papers. But we just need to be careful with thinking that if we give, you know, a novice learner the rules for using passive voice, that they will be able to, right? Like, I think that it is more about, let's start with what level are we talking about, that when in their acquisition process are we targeting this? And then, I mean, even De Kaiser admits that it's not just practice, right? It's not just this drilling. He admits, like, drills will only take you this far. Drills will not make you communicative. They will not allow you to then be able to create with language. Even De Kaiser admits that. They just see a different role for language-focused practice, which I respect. I just feel that, I don't know what analogy I can use, and it's probably going to come out wrong, but it's almost like, okay, this is a terrible analogy because I know nothing about gardening, but it would be like you're gardening and like planting something in your yard and sort of like more organically, you know, see if it grows, right? Okay, I guess they need some sun, some water. Okay, I got the basics, right? Versus, I don't know, you get one of those, you know, the gardens where that everything is done for you and they put a lot of fertilizer and everything, like, let's just get it to grow as fast as it can, as, you know, more controlled, and you get that kind of like, what do you prefer kind of thing. for me, for my students to find it more enjoyable, instead of doing so many like language focused practice of translate this and translate that, and is this right, is this wrong, my students would like zone out. I mean, at some point it would just not be enjoyable to come to class. So you just have to take it, into account your students and your goals. And my goals are not for them to get steroids of proficiency and produce these complete perfect sentences. I'm not there. To me, it's like, can I get them to be interested in the language? Can I get them to communicate, even if basically and imperfectly, in the language? And so maybe it's just that I have slightly different goals. I'm going for acquisition in a more natural and long-term way, as opposed to the right here, right now, let's get them to do these, very good sentences in present tense, right? You're very focused on one thing. I think maybe it's just two ways of going about it. But again, even De Kaiser admits that no, if we want them to get to the fluent, creative with language and all of that, no, that practice alone will not get you there.
And I found I was fortunate there were some students I started teaching in level 1, and I finished up teaching them in levels 5 and 6 at my high school because I was able to move up. And they get it. Like, you definitely see them start to acquire and use some of those grammar functions that, we would think about traditionally being taught. They're using them when they get to those upper levels, even if you're not, really pounding them in throughout the whole time. And I think the thing is, when we're talking about, okay, grammar starts to make sense maybe in the advanced levels, but if you're not having them be interested in it in the levels 1 and 2, they're not going to go to 3, they're not going to go to 4. And so when the time that it would make sense to perhaps add in some more grammar, many of our students aren't reaching that. And so I think the other thing is to really think about is, again, when you're thinking of the long-term goal, is how are we motivating our students to do it? The other anecdotal switch that I saw was, as I moved away and from so much vocabulary and grammar and really focused on a more communicative goal, my students were using the language even in level 2 when they were traveling. And so that was amazing. I had to go from, every parent-teacher conference saying why my students weren't ever speaking in the language, to having multiple parent-teacher conferences where parents would come in and tell me that their students were using the language. And even if it was just that they were understanding something that they heard. And so I think those were some of the shifts that I saw that were very motivating for me to keep going in that direction as well.
And again, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, one or the other, right? I think that even in a lot of proficiency-based, there is room for focus on form. There's room for activities where we want them to process a particular structure, right? Like, we even have examples of structured input, and structured input are all designed very carefully to target one particular structure, one particular contrast, right? So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think that there's room for language focused activities. I have no problem with that. It's to me, the issue is when that is our beginning and end, right? That is all we do, is just do these many activities to practice something. Look how good you got at these verbs. My students would just not find it very woo, I mastered the present tense, so you need to just understand your students and their goals. I just give this quick example that I know, for example, in Europe, they use certain tests, right? Like national exams. I don't know if they're national or everywhere, but they're very grammar focused, right? They're very language focused. And so they need to prepare their students to do well on these very language focused exams. And then the students feel like they have accomplished something. You have to know your context, your purpose, your goals, your learners, what is going to be motivating for them. For us, I mean, I know that you're going to think I'm just biased and it's just a sample of one, right? It's just my students, but it's like the shift of let's focus on successful communication. For them, it was almost like freeing. that they were more into it. The other approach just made them so scared of every form they were using, and it was just counterproductive for us, for our goals.
Well, so here's the last question on direct explicit instruction. Is there a place, any place, for fill in the blank style grammar exercises in proficiency-based instruction?
Look, I mean, I think that, again, depends on your context and your goals. Here's what I would say is, can you at least make them pay attention to meaning, right? Can you do it in a way that they're not like mindlessly filling in the blanks, but that at least they have to pay some attention to the meaning of the sentence? That's what I would ask first, please. And then the other thing is, how much time is this taking away from something else? So if it's something that is optional, the students enjoy it, it's going to make the students feel better. Okay, do it at home, makes you feel better, not a problem. Now, if we're taking away class time where you can be giving them some wonderful input and engaging in good conversations, and now that's being taken away so the students are filling in the blanks, then can you reconsider that model? If your goal is for them to develop communicative ability in the target language. But at the very, very least, is it completely mindless, or do they have to pay some attention to meaning? So the format itself, I have no problem with, right? The filling in the blanks is not bad just because there's a blank. That's not the issue, right? The fill in the blanks is an issue when the learners can do it without understanding anything of what's going on. That's not contributing at all for developing their linguistic system. And so it just makes me question, is it the best use of your time? If the learner enjoys it, goes to some website where that's all they're doing, and they think this is the most fun in the world, I'm not going to stop them, right? But doing them in class, then I have to be careful with what I do in class, because I want to maximize the little time we have together.
Makes sense. Maris,
do you want co-sign?
You're co-signing. Yes. Well, the question included, it's interesting, not so much whether it's going to make the students happy, but whether it's going to make the instructor happy.
Well, that's an interesting angle. But if the students are unhappy, can the instructor be happy?
No, I mean, I do think students, I don't know that students often do what they're being asked to do. And I think the question was about, it's probably coming, I suspect, from a supervisor who is dealing with instructors who are really attached to those and who have a lot of faith in what they do. And so, I think the question is, how do we approach this instructor, and how do we make sure that even if it stays a part of the curriculum, it's not harmful?
Well, okay, so then if it's something like that, what I would say is probably then at least consider my first request, which is, can you tweak it at least a little bit so that they have to pay some attention to meaning in some way, whether it is the follow-up, like a second step, whether it is that they have to know which verb goes where, like, can you at least make sure that they're paying attention to meaning? Then at least there's something that is helpful, if that makes sense. But I think it's more of let's have a conversation with the instructor to understand where the instructor is really coming from in terms of why they're assigning this, and see if we can figure an alternative, an activity. It doesn't have to be, maybe it's just because it's easier to do in class. There might be other things they can do, that contribute more to acquisition, that they don't have to take a lot of time and effort from the instructor. But anyway, long answer. I'm sorry. Maris, go for it.
Well, I was going to say, and we can go back to like one of the first questions about textbooks. Like, if you're making other shifts and maybe you're not ready to completely go away from the fill in the blank with grammar, okay. I mean, I think that yes, there are better things that can help with their proficiency to do. But if that's like, if you're making a lot of shifts and that's something that's like getting you through the day, or, you know, you come up with something and you're drawing a blank and, you know, at the last time of the year, you did some more grammar here, go for it. I mean, I think that's the other thing too, that I think we can all acknowledge is how important teachers are in our society and how much we don't want teachers to be burned out. And so if that is, you know, one thing that someone really wants to hold on to while making some other changes, okay. Like, I think that, you know, there's ways to start finding ways around it, but you also have to make sure that you're, you know, able to go, you know, back to work every day and, you know, teach every day. And so I think sometimes for sustainability's sake, if that's what's helping a teacher, then okay.
Again, but you also make a good point, Mary. It's like, I feel like what I've seen is that some instructors think that they're expecting the fill in the blanks to almost like fix every error, right? Or to improve accuracy drastically. And then they get frustrated when they don't. And then it's like, okay, just doing more fill in the blanks is not going to be the solution, and you're going to get even more frustrated, right? That's when you have to have that conversation to really figure out where this is coming from. If it is simply, you know what, my students don't seem to mind and my students enjoy it, I just need this little break, let them just work on this and then we'll do. It's, you know, it's okay. Every instructor is going to make, you know, the decisions that are best for like for the whole situation. But yeah, if you can find a way to like maximize what they can get out of it, better. That's what I would say.
And then I think you're right, Florencia, because then that's when people will see, well, I've done all of these fill in the blank exercises and my students still aren't using this this grammar point accurately. What else can I do to make it more engaging? I think like that's also sometimes where that cycle can start. So also maybe looking at it, if that, you know, to cut off that cycle as well.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because of where this conversation took us. I don't know if you're taking a look at the chat, but there is that sense sometimes that, you know, yes, we want to make all those changes, but it can feel so overwhelming sometimes. And that was the kind of the last question. One of the teachers said, I want to do it all. It's so amazing. But honestly, I don't think I have it in me to do that. As much as I understand the need for it and I want to do it, I have 6 preps, 3 different subjects, and so French, English, and taking on German. And she says, I'm not a quitter, but I just feel overwhelmed. So what can we, you know, so for these teachers, you know, who are seeing those wonderful activities, who are recognizing their value, can you talk a little bit more about the baby step approach?
I think this is going to depend so much on everybody's circumstance that anything I say is probably going to be very general. First of all, I'm in awe, you know, of that. I would feel even more overwhelmed. I think that you shouldn't be like too hard on yourself. Obviously, we wrote the book in order to be like inspirational, aspirational, right? Like to keep pushing ourselves to reflect on things and see what can we do, right? But even if it's just one activity that you see in your textbook and you're like, ooh, I don't think this is going to do a whole lot. I just don't think they're going to pay attention, right? You just go back to those questions of what information are we conveying and what are others doing with the information. So even if you keep it mostly the same, but now you found a purpose for it, you do a little step 2, right? To bring it all together to see how they can, you know, report the information. Even if it's just those little adjustments to the materials that you already have, I think it's a huge step in the right direction, right? It doesn't have to be about, I need to like ditch everything and start from scratch. That's not what we were trying to convey. More of it, can we look at our own materials and just figure out what are like reasonable things that we can adjust, and some things are just not going to go away, and it is what it is. I mean, Maris, I don't know about your courses. My courses are not perfect. I have had so many conversations with people about how it's, and I agree, how problematic it is to grade participation. And I'm sorry, I thought I was going to be able to revise all of my syllabi over the summer, and I'm so tired. Participation is staying, you know, it's like, I have to like table it for another time. I have to like prioritize what are the changes that I can make if it's like really difficult for me to figure out an alternative, right? So it's okay. It's okay to table some things for later. You know, it's like, let's put a pin on that and we'll come back to it after I've had a chance to think about it, to talk to people, whatever you need to do. You don't have to aim for like the perfect course or the acquisition driven perfection that you're going to be sharing all over Instagram. Like it doesn't have to be that way. Just do the little things that are manageable for you. That's it. And that is a huge triumph. Even if you did those two things, one thing, maybe it's a new text. You're like, okay, I like the idea of maybe talking about somebody in the community. Great. You're done. Like that. If that's the only thing you do, great. You know, it's like, just grab onto the things like I think in English, you say the low hanging fruit, right? Just grab onto those things that you're like, I can do this. Great. Don't push yourself, because then you definitely get burned out and you just don't want to do anything at all, right? So figure out which little things that are accomplishing for you in your circumstances, with your materials, whatever works for you.
And
Yeah.
well, I was going to say the other thing to kind of, again, cycle back that we talked about that's missing from a lot of textbooks is the like pre-reading activity and some post-reading activities that really summarize things other than the comprehension questions. So all textbooks typically have some sort of reading that you can look at. So use the reading and then maybe add in a pre-reading activity that we outlined in like chapters 3 and 4, or, you know, a post-reading activity, and try there, because I think if you are looking for more of a traditional textbook, that's great. And that is one place that we talked about it missing. And so there's a lot of examples in Common Ground about that. We mentioned this earlier too. The Common Ground website also has a ton of extra resources as well. So if you go on there, if nothing is shouting out to you from chapters 3 and 4, but I think that could also be a place to grab on. Also, to the person teaching all those preps, I would be overwhelmed too. Although I have small classes, I do have 5 preps, and I do a lot of the same things in my classes. So maybe the reading is different, but I'll do a similar pre-reading activity or post-reading activity, and things like that. So if you want to try something new and it makes sense to do it into classes, then you can also think about it from that perspective. And then also, depending on how close your levels are, you might be able to do something in 2 of the same classes. And so hopefully that can be effective as well when you're thinking about that shift.
And I gave a workshop for some wonderful educators down in Texas. Marita is there. And when I asked them at the end of the workshop, what is one thing that you're thinking that you would try? I mean, some of them responded things like, I want to give dictation another shot, right? How can I do dictation in a more meaningful way? That's a step forward. That is a step forward. If you saw my video on Dictogloss, which takes some time, which is great, and you don't have to, you could just do almost the entire class around it. Fantastic. You know how it is. Just try it. You know what I mean? You just try. You're like, okay, that one I can handle. Then go for it. And I'm seeing a lot of messages in the chat that precisely that's the good thing, right? You change little things, you see how it went, and that gives you that feedback for yourself to figure out, if this flies, or just throw away, this did not work for my students. But yeah, even small things like that, like, okay, maybe instead of just printing all of the comprehension questions for them, I'm going to read it to them. They're going to write them down. We're going to do a little dictation first, just try and those little things too.
Margot says in the chat, and we have to free ourselves from feeling bad if things don't work perfectly. Yeah, I
Yes, absolutely. And this is why I wanted to say, like, my courses are not perfect. The students are doing things online where I know they're losing points if they don't spell them perfectly. And it just frustrates me because the computer is that way. Like, we all struggle with those things where we know we could do better. And at some point I'll figure it out. But right now, I'm sorry, I cannot be recreating every single online activity. It's just not feasible for me. And so you have to figure out what is going to be feasible for you. And this is why I know that maybe not everybody read the epilogue, but if you get to the very end of the book, the very, very, very last paragraph, how we closed it, we said precisely that, right? That every book, every workshop, every webinar makes the presenter or the author sound like they have it all figured out and we have the perfect courses and just do what I say. It is not like that is not the reality, right? Marita, like the epilogue. Okay, awesome. Yeah, it's just, that is not, then that's why we called it reality check. You know, we have these ideas. Some of them work for me, some of them work for Maris, but not for me. You know, just you have to take into account your audience, your students first and foremost, your context, what you can handle, what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot change. And your purpose. What are your goals? Your goals might be different than mine, right?
Absolutely. All right, time is up. Lots of thank yous here in the chat. Maris, Florencia, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a really great way to finish the book club, having you both here. So thank you. This was wonderful. And I have all the resources. I am recording this webinar and I will email it to everybody who registered.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today and for your questions.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Bye.